Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, the video series where we discuss a specific faction and its underwhelming, underpowered, or underutilized lords, heroes, units, and regiments of renown, and what could be done to fix them, what could be done to improve them and make them more appealing in the multiplayer meta. In this week's video, we are going to be discussing the Warriors of Chaos, and as you can see, there isn't much to talk about, and well, that's because Chaos as a roster doesn't have many stinkers. They don't have many troubled units or units that are bad or underwhelming or whatever. The majority of their roster is pretty good. Their main problems as a faction stem from the fact that their faction just has massive gaps. The faction is essentially incomplete, and it's kind of expected that within the next half year or year, whenever Warhammer 3 does finally roll around, Chaos will most likely get a major rework and a major revamp. Perhaps new units, new lords, perhaps new marks of chaos to improve your various units and lords and that sort of thing. And that will hopefully bring the faction up to speed, or whatever speed it might be lacking. But besides that, most of the roster is strong. And in fact, many of the units that I discussed in last year's Fixing the Forgotten have since then been buffed. Units like Sigvald, like Warhounds of Chaos, like Aspiring Champions. All of those units have actually gotten buffs. Oftentimes buffs similar to the ones I hoped for. In other cases, buffs that were different from what I had hoped for, but regardless, buffs, and that is what matters. And Chaos isn't left with many underwhelming units. But there are still a handful, and that's what we're going to be focusing on here today. As usual, guys, if you've got any of your own thoughts and opinions and insights, don't hesitate to post them down below, and I'll respond as soon as I can. Now, starting things off here, we do have the Chaos Lord, and I think this guy's probably no surprise. The only Lord option on the list here for underwhelming lords, and well, that's because the Chaos Lord kind of sucks. If you want a cheap character or cheap lord, you're going to bring Sigvald, most likely, because Sigvald on foot is dirt cheap and almost unkillable. Chaos Lord on foot is a terrible fighter and is very much killable. If you want something sort of mid-priced, you're probably going to be looking at a Chaos Sorcerer, perhaps on a horse, where you get the all-in-one magic and kind of fighter combo, mostly magic though. If you want something a little pricier, you've got Archeon, who's a good fighter as well as caster. You've got, of course, Sorcerer, the Ever Chicken, who once again caster and great fighter, and he's unbreakable and causes terror. Kolek, if you just want a powerhouse fighter. And then in the odd chance that you want a dragon, that you really, really want a Chaos Dragon. Chaos Dragons suffer from some crappy animations and that sort of thing, which hinders the unit. But if you really want a Dragon Lord, which sometimes you do want, you're generally better off with a Chaos Sorcerer. Chaos Sorcerer gets certain self-buff items anyway. He still gets the Sword of Anti-Heroes. He obviously gets magic, so you get an all-in-one caster and fighter. And his stats are not too much worse. He does get 8 less melee attack and I believe 4 less melee defense. But ultimately, those stats are pretty comparable. And so yeah, poor Chaos Lord kind of sucks in all departments. His kit, he's also fairly expensive, and this is probably the biggest killer. And this, if I was going to recommend an immediate fix, it would be a cost cut. In my opinion, a Chaos Lord on a dragon is not worth more than 2,100 or 2,200. If you compare his stats to something like a Star Dragon, which only costs 100 more, he's inferior almost across the board. The only advantage he has is 5 more charge bonus and 10 speed. 800 less HP, we're talking 10 less melee attack, 6 less melee defense, inferior weapon strength by 30. He's just worse across the friggin' board. And you're almost paying the same thing on a faction that doesn't even have healing to prop up the Chaos Lord long term. So that's in and of itself an issue. So I think price-wise, Chaos Lord could easily go down by 100 gold, maybe 200 gold. If he's on foot, he costs almost as much as friggin' Sigvald, despite being way less tanky and way easier to kill. Now, what I would like to see, personally, is a more in-depth rework, a more in-depth rethinking of the Chaos Lord. And that would revolve around marks. At the moment, the Chaos Lord has this awkward mix of items, and some of them really don't synergize well with his fighting form. Like, for example, Filth Mace is clearly designed to make him better in combat. But it buffs non-AP damage, which doesn't affect his Dragon, which is his one good combat form. And Terror, which a Dragon already gets. So you're just getting poison. You're paying for an entire item to get poison. Pendant of Slanesh, decent self-buff, certainly. He's got Deadly Onslaught, Foe Seeker. Standard Eye, it's an okay AoE buff. But really, what you're getting here with your items doesn't necessarily synergize all that well with what you want. Obviously, Pendant of Slanesh kind of worthless on any other version of the Chaos Lord. And what I'd like to see is a more in-depth mark-based custom system. So, for example, you would have 4 abilities, and these would each be a mark. And you could have Mark of Nurgle, for example, and Mark of Nurgle would grant your Lord regeneration. And that mark would then unlock 2 items that you could choose from in your item pool. And these items could be centered around Nurgle. So you could have poison, you could have something that grants more missile resist, or something that grants more physical resist. Just items that make you tankier, beefier, and grindier. You could have a Mark of Corn, which, for example, could grant Frenzy, much like the one on the Exalted Hero does. And then that would unlock items based on themed around Corn. You could, for example, have Heroic Killing Blow, get that massive burst of damage output. Or maybe an item that would cause your Lord to fight better the longer they're in combat. Some sort of berserk mechanic. Abilities like that. And something similar could be extended for Slaanesh and Tzeentch. Tzeentch maybe could give you magic resist, and then you get some additional some bound spells, for example. Or actually give you some AoE support, which normally this character is much more about himself. And I think that fits Chaos. Chaos is a Chaos theme is kind of selfishness in many ways, so I don't feel that a Chaos Lord should be all that good of a support character. But with Tzeentch, for example, you could have a little more support in there, options in there with some magic, for example, some bound magic. Maybe with Slaanesh, you could have some sort of immunity psychology aura, something like that as well. So regardless, that is how I would like to see the Chaos Lord reworked ideally. As it stands, I think a price cut is really what's necessary, and a general fix on the Chaos Dragon animations. Moving on to heroes, the Chaos Sorcerer I'm going to cover really quickly because he's not here because he's bad, though he's obviously pricey because you pay for a caster who's also a fighter, so that can sometimes not be ideal. Sometimes you just want a cheap caster, and this guy's never cheap, but that's not his thing. That just is what it is. Chaos Sorcerer. But the Forbidden Rod, it's terrible. It's a terrible item on this guy. I really wish to see it would just swap it out for something else. A caster that has fairly low HP and on a faction with no healing, so unlike, say, a Necromancer who can just regen HP, so he can spam a Forbidden Rod all he wants, Chaos Sorcerer can't spam Forbidden Rod. And while this self-damage theme might make sense for Chaos, the fact that your Winds of Magic gain isn't that big for Forbidden Rod, while simultaneously you're killing a fairly expensive caster to do so, making it more difficult to get overcasts off, opening the possibility to get sniped more easily, that sort of thing. It just sucks. So what I would like to see is either give this guy, say, a Scroll of Power, let him get a second cast off quickly, or give him something like Blast. Just any item that isn't Forbidden Rod, in my opinion. Jagged Dagger could be decent. If they really insist on Forbidden Rod, maybe give him something more extreme that's even more self-damaging and just gives you a boatload of Winds of Magic, so you could have some interesting interaction there. But as it stands, Forbidden Rod just isn't a good trade-off, in my opinion. Moving on to Exalted Hero, and this guy, once again, I don't think is too terrible. I've actually been using him a decent amount. I like him against Skaven, for example. You throw this guy on a horse, he's pretty mobile, can compromise backlines and weapon teams, and fight some of the more annoying characters like Broodars or mounted characters, for example. That said, still kind of a pricey hero with some pricey itemization. Hellfire Sword, for example, very expensive, 150 plus gold item. That doesn't really boost your stats that much. I think it could be a bit cheaper, or maybe boost the stats a little bit more. Does obviously have synergy with, say, Archeon and fire damage buffs, but I don't really think it's a 150 gold worth item. Otherwise, his combat stats are across the board not particularly bad. For his price, if you compare him, for example, to Blackrock Big Boss, he's very comparable and much cheaper. So price-wise, I think he's pretty fairly priced. Does suffer a bit from just not being able to get on key targets because he's stuck essentially on a foot or on a horse. Potentially on a Manticore, but on the Manticore, he's a little squishy. I think on a Manticore, he could use, say, a couple hundred more HP. Nothing too huge, but 300 or 400 more HP would help this guy for sure. And yeah, nothing too severe there. Once again, I would like to see this guy get marks be made more into options. If you could, for example, have a mark of, even if it doesn't come with items, even if he has more generic hero items, and then you just have a specific mark you pick in your abilities, like say Mark of Nurgle for regen, or Mark of Corn as we've got here. I think that would be cool just to get some more customization in that sense. But unfortunately, yeah, I don't think he's a terrible character. I will say that. I like him in certain matchups. But I do think he could use a little bit more something, a little bit of a price cut on Hellfire Sword. Perhaps a slight boost to, say, charge bonus, or slight boost to these damage output just a tiny bit. As it stands, pretty comparable to Blackrook Big Boss. I just think some of the biggest problems with this guy are that really his itemization is a bit weak. It's very much fighting oriented, which is fair. Okay, this is Chaos. Chaos is all about selfishness and fighting, and they're not organized, and it's not a random organized hero the way, for example, a Blackrook is. But which Blackrooks are supposed to be exceptionally disciplined for orcs. But ultimately, I could see the Exalted Hero be given some sort of small aura, something that boosts leadership or melee attack, maybe something that applies when in melee, just inspiring nearby allies to fight better. Could do something that synergizes with specific unit types, perhaps. Rather than having a Guardian effect, maybe have something that buffs nearby champions because they see this guy as a competitor. So maybe have something that makes it so nearby lords and heroes fight and get better combat stats when they're fighting near him, that sort of thing. But just some mild tweaks related to his itemization is what I would like to see. Moving on to infantry, there's only the Forsaken here. Forsaken are not actually that terrible of a unit, but I do think they've kind of fallen off in Warhammer 2. Warhammer 1, these guys were a meta staple pick. Fairly mobile infantry that hit super hard on the charge in a game where HP pools were much lower. HP pools in Warhammer 2 climbed up quite a bit, depending on what units we're talking about. Single entities, not so much, but cavalry, and in particular infantry, tended to have a massive spike in HP. Forsaken, not so much. As you can see here, they're stuck at 5,500. And before you point out that there's other units, like, for example, War Dancers, that have even less, or Witch Elves, a lot of those units have physical resist, which ends up pushing that unit's effective HP into, say, the 6,000s. So Forsaken are a uniquely very, very squishy infantry unit for their cost, for a 750 gold unit. They do hit fairly hard, but at the same time, it's really only on the charge. That 36 charge bonus plus frenzy synergizes really nicely with 60 weapon strength. But ultimately, in sustained combat, you've only got 40 melee attack with frenzy active, so it's not that much. Personally, I don't think they need a huge tweak. I think a slight buff and a couple hundred extra HP would be nice, just to make them a little bit beefier, a little bit sturdier against incoming damage. Otherwise, slightly better melee attack, just to make... I don't want these guys to... just so that they kill faster in melee. So even if they... so it would leave them still vulnerable to enemy counterattacks, but it would mean that offense is the best defense. They can potentially plow through an infantry line pretty quickly. But really, ideally, I'd just like to see these guys get a couple hundred more HP. If it was like 300 more, you're talking 5 extra HP per model. I think would be a nice little buff for Forsaken. And that does move us to the Swords of Chaos. And Swords of Chaos are, in my mind, probably... they actually might be the worst unit out of these, except the Chaos Lord. Swords of Chaos just struggle. They're an awesome looking unit. Granted, those hideous heads are really something. But yeah, they look awesome. You got those barded Chaos Warhorses and crazy burning swords. The problem is that within the Chaos roster, they just don't perform well. Chaos isn't a roster that's well built to support cavalry. It's actually one of the reasons that Chaos Knights in general just don't perform or aren't seen that often, because despite being good for their stats, there's just no healing and no blob lord like Faye or Carl or Volkmar or Elariel to support them. So Swords of Chaos just kind of fall in that trap. And yes, they do have Guardian. Yes, they do have the Apocalyptic Charge. But their damage output, if you need to fight something big and beefy, you'd rather have Dragon Ogres. These guys are susceptible to cannon fire with 18 models, with that HP divvied up across 18 models. They do still get one shot by cannonballs, which kind of sucks. Unlike, say, Dragon Ogres, who can tank a cannonball, especially because they've got missile resist. So they're very vulnerable to that sort of model sniping, and of course they've got no healing, so Spirit Leech will do full damage to this unit, and you can't recover that HP. You do, of course, have some pretty good combat stats for cavalry unit, which is neat and all, but ultimately they just feel a bit lackluster. My personal instinct would just be to drop their cost a bit, make them a little bit cheaper, maybe 1,700 gold cav. I really don't think they're worth 1,800 gold in their current state. Obviously, they might outfight certain anti-large cav. Maybe they outfight, I believe. I'm not even sure if they did outfight Demigryph Halberds. I know they used to lose, but they were buffed a bit somewhat recently, though I don't think enough. Otherwise, I could see cutting them down to even slower unit count, give them even bigger combat stats. So make them like a 12 model unit, and give them an Encourage aura, for example, and give them better weapon strength. Buff that weapon strength up to, say, 100, and suddenly they become a much more universal version of Dragon Ogres. At the moment, one of the big problems with Dragon Ogres is they suck against infantry. So while they are good against large, and in general you will prefer Dragon Ogres to Swords of Chaos, if Swords of Chaos had if they had a higher base weapon strength, they wouldn't be as good against large, but in fact against factions where you're anticipating a lot of non-AP fire, they'd be a better choice than, say, Dragon Ogres for fighting enemy monsters. They'd be less easy to zone out. They'd be more resistant to cannonball sniping. Perhaps they could be immune to cannonball sniping. I'm not sure what the exact HP threshold would have to be there. But just make them a very expensive, very elite, essentially monstrous cavalry. That's actually just normal cavalry, but something that functions more along the lines of full-blown monstrous infantry, like Dragon Ogre Shackets. But as it stands, I just think they're a little bit lackluster and not too horrible, but definitely a bit shy of the mark. Regardless, that is my thoughts there for Chaos. Obviously not too much, as mentioned. I think a lot of other units have been buffed to competitiveness. Aspiring Champions, Marauder Great Weapons, Hounds, of course, got Vanguard. Sigvald's way better than he once was. All those units, just way better. Chaos in general, in a strong position. I think they're a solid faction overall, and I think that once Warhammer 3 and their buffs there roll around, they'll be in a very, very strong spot. But as for their current roster, this is all I could think of. Be sure to let me know what you guys think down below. If you disagree, if you think there's more I could have added, or that these units are actually pretty good, let me know. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Or if you think some of those items that I mentioned, because really some of this was more about itemization than anything. If you think some of those items are better than I claim they are, certainly let me know down in the comments below. I'll respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.